Tim Davie resigned. Welcome to Free Speech Nation with me, Josh Howard. So yes, breaking news tonight. Tim Davie, the Director General of the BBC, has announced his resignation this evening amid allegations of bias at the corporation. It is understood in a statement. Davie says, "There have been some mistakes made, and as Director General, I have to take ultimate responsibility." The move comes following a torrid week for Britain's national broadcaster after it was accused of airing a doctored clip of a speech by President Trump and failing in its coverage of Gaza and trans issues. Deborah Turnus, the broadcaster's CEO of News, has also resigned. Well, first of all, we are going to be joined by the Director of Campaigns at Sex Matters, Fiona McAnena. Fiona, welcome to the show. This is breaking news. You were already booked in to talk about part of the reason why Tim Davie has now resigned. First of all, what are your initial thoughts on this?
Well, it's inevitable he had to go, didn't he? Because the failings are shocking. But if he calls that some mistakes, I'm afraid he's still gaslighting us and trying to pretend that what happened didn't happen. It's a catalogue of errors. And more importantly, it's gone on for over 10 years. You know, the Trump issue is the headline, but as we'll discuss, the transgender misrepresentation is probably the most egregious because they have been promoting an ideology that makes children unhappy. They've misrepresented puberty blockers as being harmless and just a pause button, and I could go on. So this had to happen, but is it enough? Because, you know, and again, these people who've resigned, they're not the ones who wrote the pregnant people script that Martine Croxall famously had to change. So this is the beginning, but it's very far from a solution to the problem.
Well, absolutely. So look, let's talk about this ideological capture. And as you say, I don't believe either, frankly, that it is, you know, some instances, some occasions here. The rot arguably goes much deeper. So you say it started about 10 years ago. What kind of examples could you bring to the...
Yeah, there are two examples that I think are worth just dwelling on because they represent the most harmful aspect of this, which is, you know, preying on the vulnerabilities of children. So the I Am Leo video documentary was made for Children's BBC, and it showed a girl who believed herself to be a boy and was put on I believe was put on a full medical pathway by the Tavistock Gender Identity Clinic. The director of that clinic, Polly Carmichael, was on the show, and she was talking gently about how puberty blockers were just a pause button, and there was a little graphic on the screen to show the pause button, and it all sounded very lovely and very benign. But if that young person went on that pathway, it's almost certain she then would have gone to cross-sex hormones, which would make her infertile. She would lose her sexual function. She would be sterile. She would have no ability to feel sexual pleasure. That is so far from benign. So that's one example, and that film went out 11 years ago. And as I say, it was aimed at children. That's hard to forgive, and it's not just a mistake. And then the other example I would give you is the infamous 100 Genders film. Now, that was educational content from the BBC. And you remember that there's a teacher who talks to children and they ask her questions like, what is the difference between sex and gender? And she explains that people can have one thing in their mind and another thing in their body. And she says, well, in fact, it's a very exciting question because nowadays there are over 100 genders. Now, that is BBC educational content.
That's for primary school children, right?
Primary school children were in the film, and many people complained about that, and I was one of them, and I pursued a correspondence all the way to the bitter end and was told in writing by the Director of Complaints at the BBC that teachers and children shouldn't really take this stuff literally.
Yeah, I mean,
and I said to him, well, what use is educational content from the BBC if it can't be relied on, if it's not true? And actually, as an admission, I find it pretty shocking, because what does that mean? You can't rely on anything they say? So the educational content for the BBC, by the way, is not regulated by Ofcom. For some reason, they seem to regulate their own content. So that was the end of the road for the 100 Genders film. It was eventually withdrawn. But who knows how much harm it had already done. And those are just two examples. That film was first put out 6 years ago.
And wasn't it that when that film was withdrawn because people, you know, the outcry from people pointing this out, that even then, I believe some institutions, I think Stonewall, seem to remember anyway, was very much complaining that this film had been withdrawn, even though it was just an outright example of dangerous ideological capture being taught to primary school age children. So I think part of the problem is what you were saying there is the director of complaints. I've complained to the BBC. This is it's supposedly our institution. We pay for it, and again, you have to see this stuff through, and they will just constantly mark their own homework. So part of the problem seems to be not just this ideological capture, but then the actual sort of shielding of it by the executives. And I believe there's also in this report that came out from the Telegraph this week. Can we talk about the Pride Network or the LGBTQ plus committee or whatever it was that basically any time you were going to write a story or make a story on this stuff, it had to go through them, right?
Well, that's what they asked for. So what we do know is that there's an LGBT staff network that has a great deal of influence. And one of the things that happens when a journalist tries to write anything negative about transgender issues is they'll get complaints against them from their own colleagues from that staff network. So that's one thing. Another thing is that there is there has been this LGBT and identity desk. So there's a little team, and they were the people who had the kind of control over stories. So anything, for example, something like puberty blockers, the CAS review or the WPATH files, you might think of those as being health stories. But no, they were funneled to the LGBT and identity desk, who then decided whether to report them and how to report them. And so the problem isn't just the promotion of bad ideas and harmful ideas, it's also that really important information never reached people. And, you know, even now you hear people say, well, if there really was a problem, if there were, you know, if it was true that puberty blockers are harmful, we'd have heard it on the BBC. If there really were male rapists in women's prisons, we'd have heard about it on the BBC. And that team, that journalist team, played an important role in making sure we did not hear about it on the BBC, and that's part of the problem. So the legacy of this is going to take a lot to unpick from the BBC.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Fiona McAnena from Sex Matters. We have got some breaking news for you. The White House Press Secretary, Caroline Leavitt, who has simply said, "Shot chaser." There we go. So I think she's pretty happy. Well, look, I'm going to join us. I'm going to be joined now by our comedians. We have Leo Kearse and Mriam Elia. Let's have a round of applause. So, Leo, you arrived, you heard this news. What are your first thoughts on this?
My first thoughts were, man, I came all the way in to do this show, and I'm not going to be talking for the whole thing because Tim Davies resigned. No, I mean, I think Tim Davies, everybody thinks he's resigned because of this Panorama fiasco. You know, Panorama doctored this footage of Trump that made Trump look like he wanted violence at the Capitol riots, and it really undermines, you know, any claim that Trump actually wanted that. It's like, if you've got to fake it, then, you know, obviously he didn't mean it, or he didn't say anything like that, because if he did, you'd use the actual footage. But yeah, Tim Davies hasn't resigned because of that. Tim Davies resigned because I reckon the BBC's got about 4 months left. Everybody's worked out that you don't have to pay your licence fee. You know what I mean? And each year they put it up. It's up to like £180 now, which means I am now earning £180 by not paying my licence fee. It's amazing. Every year the BBC gives me more money. It's an amazing system. So I think Tim Davies just gone because he wants to get a job at the Shopping Channel or something like that. Maybe he's going to come here. Maybe he's going to hand in a CV here.
Well, you know what? He might, in which case we better start speaking nicely about him.
I think he'll start as like, you know, probably the janitor or something and work his way up.
Well, that's where I started. So
you can get a new suit.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So, Mriam, what do you see there? When you've got the press secretary for the White House coming out with the statement, this is international news.
Well, it should be, because it's like you can only build up this up to a certain point and everything is going to collapse, because if it's all based on a lie, then unsustainable. There's a woke word they love. So I'm not really remotely surprised by it in a way. It's a really good thing, and I hope the whole thing just collapses. All the ideology kind of splashes all over the floor like sewer water, and then we build it up again.
Well, that's a great point. Do you think this is going to actually fix anything at all? I mean, you were saying the BBC is going to collapse, but do you really think that 2 resignations are actually going to sort out what is really a cultural issue?
Well, you know what? Tim Davie was actually a very rare sort of based conservative voice in the BBC. He isn't one of the... He's not a paid-up member of the woke cult who are guiding things, who have such a strong influence that they're actually... Panorama is faking footage. Panorama, the flagship documentary programme, is faking footage to try and score points. So I think Tim Davie's departure could actually mean the BBC gets worse in terms of wokeism and becomes more left-wing, because they'll probably promote somebody else to Director General who's not conservative. I mean, I think Tim Davie's quite a rarity in that respect. I mean, unless I'm willing to do the job. Headliners is finished, so I'm willing to do it. In fact, I'll take 20 quid less than what Tim Davie was doing it for.
Yeah, but I'll take 30. Yes. But then it's not necessarily even about the political leanings of Tim Davie. It's about the ability to stand up for the core beliefs of Reithian ideas of what the BBC was built around, surely, and stand up to... Mriam, what do you think? Are they going to be able to find someone who's going to be able to stand up to some of these nut jobs who work at the BBC?
Well, no, unfortunately, the whole mindset is like a religion. So you have to kind of, because it's completely irrational, which they don't really understand themselves. So it's kind of like unpicking that, and that's going to take a long time because it's all based around feelings which are invulnerable. So I'm really not sure how it's going to happen. And Leo might be right, it might just get worse.
We'll find out. Well, look, we're going to return to you guys in a second. Right now, though, we have an interview with the chair of InterTalent, Jonathan Shalit. He joins us. Welcome, Jonathan. Big news today, international news. The White House press secretary even coming in for a little dig there. What are your feelings?
Well, I think the fact the White House press secretary has put out that message in the last 20 minutes is the biggest statement of all and demonstrates exactly why the 2 people who have gone today have had to go. This is not just a local country's television station. This is a national television station in the United Kingdom, which to the world represents the views of the United Kingdom, whether it does or it doesn't. And our national broadcaster chose to miscommunicate something the president of the greatest country in the world said. So inevitably this had to happen because, the British Prime Minister will have to speak to the American president next week and explain how the national broadcast of the UK said the president incited a riot. We all thought he incited this riot. I'm sure you thought, every viewer watching this broadcast right now thought the president of America incited a riot, and we found out he didn't. And we learned that from the BBC, or to be exact, Panorama. And that's what I think is missing from all this conversation. It's the editor of Panorama who's the real villain on this, because yes, Deborah Turner is the head of news and Tim Davie is the director general, but they're not the editors of Panorama. I'm assuming the editor of Panorama of this particular episode has long gone from the BBC. Well, if he or she hasn't, they should have gone, because it shouldn't have happened on the day, let alone what happened with the report afterwards.
Well, this is it. It's a failure from an editor. A failure then goes up to the editor, and then through the entire process, do you think that the rot is too deep at BBC News to be able to save it?
No, I think that's that's just sort of playing to the gallery and nonsense. I remember a previous Director General, Greg Dyke, so that when defending a BBC controversy, was saying we get 95% right. Well, he was wrong on that statement, because the job of the BBC is to get 100% right. And absolutely, this is a catastrophic mistake by the BBC and an error of judgment that wasn't dealt with both at the time and after the event properly. But it's not rotten to the core. They're fantastic.
OK, well, sorry, just to interrupt, you're saying this is a mistake. The report that came out through the Telegraph shows it's not a mistake. And even Tim Davie himself tries to sort of pass off as a couple of mistakes. We are talking about systemic failure going on for years.
No, when I said a mistake, absolute mistake, how it was handled, an awful mistake, a mistake that's had the right conclusion. But I don't believe the BBC is systemic wrong in every sense. You have to first of all remember individual BBC programmes operate in their own way. So the Today programme on Radio 4 tomorrow, for example, which I'm sure will cover this extensively, their editorial team will decide how they approach it. The editorial team on BBC Breakfast will decide how they approach it. There isn't one person controlling all the news and current affairs programmes at the BBC. So what has to be checked are the individual editors, the individual bosses of each programme, the correct person for the job, because the BBC doesn't have an agenda overall, that each individual programme sets their own agenda, and that's where the neutrality has to happen.
Well, I'd like to, disagree with you there, because I believe the BBC, frankly, does have an agenda where the editors of the different programmes, as has been shown from this report, but you know what, not just this report in the Telegraph, from multiple reports over the years, the way that ideologically it's been captured and how it's presented trans issues, on how it's presented Gaza, shows that it doesn't matter that it's down to individuals, it's that if all of them think the same thing and are pushing this same ideology, and then when those falsehoods get pushed up and aren't challenged, and we've got someone on later, a professor from Oxford, who's talking about how history's been captured even at the BBC, then we've got two problems. We've got an ideology, or many ideologies here, that some of them aren't based on facts and truth, and then we have a complaints procedure that isn't followed through on. So I think it is wider than one editor, two editors. You don't see that there's any larger problem here, really?
I see that clearly. I actually see there's a problem on the complaints procedure, because you had an independent report from an independent director of the BBC, and it was not acted on. That's a separate issue to each programme, how each programme is handled. And, you know, when you talk about Gaza, I absolutely personally believe that Gaza's been handled in a very biased way, repeatedly over and over again. But equally, Palestinian friends of mine feel it's been badly handled from their perspective. So there is no defining answer on Gaza, because each side has their own views, and each side, since the BBC thinks the BBC is biased to the other side. So that's a matter of opinion. I'm not saying what side's right or wrong.
Well, one side has lots of evidence and examples like 14,000 babies supposedly dying within 24 hours or 48 hours, and the other side doesn't.
But that makes you biased then by making that statement.
Well, I'm not biased, I'm stating a fact.
Yeah, but
there's a difference between opinion and fact.
Yeah. But imagine very simply, Notting Hill Carnival, 8,000 people are killed by terrorists. That was the equivalent of what happened in Israel.
Yeah, and more people died in Sudan last week than in 2 years over the Gaza. But anyway, we could talk about this and it'll be lots of fun. But thank you very much for joining us. That is the chair of InterTalent, Jonathan Shalit. Thank you very much for joining us, Jonathan. So we have a statement now from Nigel Farage. He's called in. Oh, no, he's doing it on X. I thought he was doing it on my phone. Posting on X, he says, Davey and Turness going must be the start of wholesale change. The government need to appoint someone with a record of coming in and turning companies and the cultures around. Preferably, it would be someone coming in from the private sector who has run a forward-facing business and understands PR. This is the BBC's last chance. If they don't get it right, there will be vast numbers of people refusing to pay the licence fee. So let's go back now to our comedian guest there. You think it's last chance? Do you think that they deserve another chance? Do you think that it is possible that they can redeem themselves? Because you know what, Mriam? I personally, actually, I'm still an idealist. I don't mind paying a licence fee if I get the service, the promised service of impartiality and quality. That's a big if, by the way, but if I get it, I don't mind paying that money.
Right.
I didn't mind it before, a couple of years ago, essentially. Do you think that it's just the rot is too deep?
Yeah. I think I saw it coming like 20 years ago, so because I used to work at the BBC at that time.
So what was it like then working at the BBC? I used to work at the BBC.
It was a long time before the culture. Now it's just gone on steroids, hasn't it, and rainbows. But it was already kind of had specific things that could be said, couldn't be said, and I sensed even back then that there was an ideological kind of agenda, and obviously I wasn't as sophisticated as I am now, but it was kind of obvious. But in a way, sometimes it's like a train wreck, you know, it has to happen, and then you rebuild afterwards. But it's good that at least I mean, I don't pay the licence fee either, so
Okay.
And I love the threatening letters. I
think the
them.
three of us should go out after.
I put them up on my fridge.
£180. Just buy the audience lots of drinks. What do you think about Nigel Farage's statement there? Do you think that getting in someone from the private sector, that's what's going to solve the problem here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Reform are going to have some great ideas about how to actually reform the BBC as one of our institutions. It's obviously not serving the people of Britain. It, woefully misrepresents, swathes of the population. I mean, for all the BBC's got all these, diversity and inclusion coordinators. You know for a fact there's never going to be an inclusion coordinator, making sure there's enough of the actually, shunned and actually marginalised people represented. There's never going to be an inclusion coordinator making sure there's enough Brexit voters or gammons on a particular show. Apart from here maybe. But it's for something that's funded through this regressive flat tax on an entire population, you'd think they'd be kinder to the people who are paying them instead of openly spitting in their face all the time. And I think the BBC is still one of the absolute marquee brands worldwide. It's got a far better reputation overseas than it does here. That might change, if David Attenborough ever dies. But
that's what makes it so dangerous.
Yeah.
When it comes to ideological capture,
yeah.
In that their word is taken as
gospel,
absolute gospel across the world.
Yeah, and they've got this BBC Verify service. So they've got this department inside the BBC with 60 employees, and it's funded with like £3.5 million a year or something like that, or £30 million. It's some ridiculous amount of money, and they're supposed to check everything, and they're supposed to be the absolute final arbiters on what is true and what isn't. And even the person who set it up, lied on their CV to get a job. They're the absolute. It's absolute sort of communist state propaganda. And I think this is where people on the right and also people on the left, like Ken Loach, has criticised the BBC for essentially being, the Britain's Pravda, the sort of the propaganda tool for the middle classes. I think we really need to reform it to sort of restore what the BBC actually does to sort of match the brand that it's got around the world.
Absolutely. I mean, Leo raises a great point, Mriam. Like, it's almost like the scorn for parts of this country. I guess we saw it coming with, Brexit. I went along with the madness, by the way. I was brainwashed.
What, with the Brexit thing?
And all of that?
I voted
because no, but I know you voted Brexit. But my point is that the BBC at the time, that was where I got all of my news, and I just assumed that anybody who voting for Brexit was a bad human being. But it sort of it started there. Or some people argue that it goes back way longer than that. I wonder what happened.
That was a very interesting moment, though, because I remember going to sleep. I went to vote, and then I just Brexit. I didn't think much of it. Really, I didn't. Woke up in the morning and was like, "You're a racist! You're xenophobic! Horrible person!"
That was me calling you in the morning, wasn't it?
Morning, I hate you, Mriam. And my dad, who's a Lebanese refugee, came here in the 70s. He voted Brexit.
That's it. But
actually, the more I remember going around town talking to cab drivers. Cab drivers always have their wits about them, and they're from everywhere, from Ethiopia, from Algeria, and I was like, "Well, did you vote Brexit?" They were like, "Yeah, vote Brexit."
I love migrants.
And then all my white middle class friends that I grew up around in Muswell Hill, they acted like the complete reverse.
Well, this is it.
So that I realised that they were living that I'd grown up in a bubble that was disconnected from.
And the BBC kind of provided the shield of that bubble, certainly for me, because absolutely, I literally, my brain couldn't handle that. Who would possibly have voted for Brexit? Because the BBC didn't seem to represent at the time, half of the country.
And it's just one of the institutions. I mean, all of our NGOs and all of our institutions have been sort of infiltrated and captured by activists who pose as experts. It's like, oh, I'm an expert on trans rights. It's like, no, you're not an expert on trans rights. You're an absolute hardcore activist who just wants to cut the testicles off children. Let's be honest about it. I mean, you've found this hammer, and now everything looks like a nail to you. And unfortunately, you know, the hammer is a scalpel, and the nails are children. So all of our institutions have, to some extent or another, been captured by these far left activists. And I think the BBC is just the most visible example. But I mean, this thing that the doctoring of the Trump footage, I don't think it's even close to the worst thing that Panorama have done recently. I mean, there's the bogus Tommy Robinson documentary, where the guy making the documentary was found to have said all these horrific homophobic things and just been you know, drinking about half the license fee during the making of it. But there's also, more recently, the Panorama documentary, the investigation. They went undercover in Charing Cross police station, and after, you know, plying police officers with drink and goading them, they found out that they actually have quite a dim view of some of the demographics that they have to deal with. You know, the guy isn't a huge fan of illegal migrants or Somalians, and he thinks Muslims are problematic. And they're saying, oh, this is so terrible, this is so awful. And the police officers were fired. And then the next day, a Muslim goes on the rampage in Manchester, stabbing Jews and killing them. And it's like, isn't this exactly what this police officer was talking about? But we've all got to pretend, oh no, don't look back in anger. Let's have a poetry reading. Let's light a candle. It's the religion of peace. It's like, no, come on, start being real. And your documentary show should be the place that's being real. I understand if you want to put all the social engineering nonsense in your soap operas, you know, where you know, whoever it is, Tracy on EastEnders gets a Somalian migrant boyfriend who turns out to be, you know, a doctor and a surgeon and an engineer. But, you know, in Panorama, we should have some reality.
I didn't want to stop you there. I thought you could literally go off the next 2 hours. That was incredibly impressive. Give her a round of applause. Right. So, speaking this morning, and Mriam, we're going to come to you for a 5-minute rant in 2 seconds. Get yourself ready. So, speaking this morning on the BBC before Tim Davie resigned, this is what Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy had to say on the ongoing scandal at the BBC.
I have complete confidence that both Samir Shah, the chair of the BBC, and Tim Davie are treating this with the seriousness that this demands. I do want to see that response to the Select Committee, and I will, of course, consider it and have further conversations with them about the action that they're taking.
Well, we are joined now by the journalist and broadcaster Michael Crick. Michael, welcome to the show. Huge news, international news. What are your first thoughts?
Well, I think it's very, very sad. I really do. I think the BBC has had a problem with bias in some ways. I wouldn't exaggerate it. And I think other channels have problems with bias. In fact, virtually all channels have problems with bias, not least your own. But the BBC is one of Britain's great institutions. And there seem to be a lot of people out there determined to destroy the BBC and all the advantages, because the BBC hasn't handled this well. It should have handled it a lot better. Tim Davie recognised the problem and was determined to do something about it, and it's really sad that he's going now. I was an admirer of Tim Davie in that regard. I think he should have got ahead of the problem much earlier in the last few days, slow to respond. But overall, I think he was a good man and doing a good job. And goodness knows who's going to be able to take the job on and sort this all out. But it's a bad day. The BBC is an extraordinary, it's a wonderful institution. It's one of the things this nation should be most proud of. And I'm afraid it's going to be more and more difficult to do that from now on. At a time when I think also what's happened is that a lot of the pressure has been people with commercial interests in destroying the BBC. The pressure from newspapers, the pressure from rival television stations, rival broadcasters, and possibly also the pressure of a different kind from the White House. And that is something that we need to know more about. Did the White House put any pressure in any way on the BBC, on the Director General, or maybe through the offices of Downing Street for this decision to take place, these two resignations? Or did Deborah Turnus and Tim Davie resign totally off their own volition?
Michael, you mentioned there the kind of ideological capture of other organisations and the bias. And you're right, I do have a bias in that I think that, you know, men shouldn't be in women's sports and that there are only two sexes. And that when our national broadcaster reports on a war abroad, it shouldn't outright lie. And unfortunately, all of those things have been pushed by them. Do you see that the problem is larger?
I hope you know what the word lie means.
Yes, I do know what the word lie means. 14,000 babies dying in 48 hours and starving is a lie.
Well, it may have been a mistake.
Well, then,
a lie is when a lie. There's a difference between a lie and
it may have been a mistake that was then repeated.
Right, so you're withdrawing the term lie. Now that was clearly not right, and I hope they corrected it. I can't remember if they did.
In a very minor way.
Especially a war. Will you listen to me?
Of course.
Especially in war, a war where Israel has refused to let anybody from the outside world, including GB News,
into a war zone run by Hamas terrorists. Into a war zone controlled by Hamas terrorists.
Will you let me finish?
I'd love to.
If you're not going to let me finish, I will go.
No, sorry, I apologise. Please.
Yes, thank you. A war zone where no journalist has been allowed in from the outside world. In those circumstances, it's likely that people are going to make mistakes. And when they do make mistakes, they should apologise for them and they should correct them. And I think that is what, in the instance you've mentioned, I think that's what the BBC have done. But I might be wrong. I might have made a mistake, in which case I apologise. But I think the circumstances of the Gaza war are extremely difficult for all broadcasters to get the balance right, to get the facts right, where you're excluded. Most wars in the history of broadcasting, people have been able to go there at great personal risk and courage. And a lot of broadcasters have been killed. Nonetheless, they've gone to these war zones and reported to their honest ability of what's going on. That has not been possible in Gaza. And inevitably, it's made it difficult to broadcast the truth. And it's very easy for a glib station like you and a glib presenter like you to make an accusation of somebody lying when, in fact, all that happened was that they made an honest mistake.
OK, well, then what about a documentary that they put out? Is that a lie that the person who was the narrator of the documentary is not to be revealed as a son of a member of Hamas, one of the leaders in Hamas? Is that a lie or just another mistake?
No, look, we've got to be careful here. One of the problems with this whole debate is everything becomes polarised and exaggerated. Now, that was a mistake, clearly a mistake. The BBC has said it was a mistake. It was a mistake that appears to have taken place within the production company. It was a horrendous mistake. And I think that one of the problems that the BBC has had in the last few months is it's been very slow to get a grip on these mistakes and to, if necessary, sack people. And I think sackings probably were necessary, and to make sure that they don't happen again. And what Tim Davies failing, I think, over the last few days has been to not get ahead of the story. And I mean, I think it was absurd to say that that the BBC would be making an apology tomorrow, Monday. It should have made the apology straight away. As soon as it was decided, an apology, and we need more than an apology, frankly, we need an explanation as to how the Trump thing occurred.
Well, sorry, just with the Trump thing, would you say the Trump thing is a mistake or a lie? I'm just genuine question.
Well, it's difficult for me to say at this stage because I'm going to be honest with you. I haven't had a chance in the last few days because I've been busy doing other things to actually get hold of the video of the program and the raw material and to compare the two. Clearly, it was a mistake. Now, whether it was a deliberate, the trouble with lies is the term lies is you have to know what the motivating force was behind the person that did it. Now, if somebody in a cutting room somewhere in the independent company October Films deliberately set out, knowing that these two bits were not part of the same sequence and all of that, if they did that knowingly, then I would accept it comes close to a lie. But we don't know that, and we won't know that until there's an investigation into this incident. So if I were you, I would be rather careful about using the term lie. I have always taken the rule in life that you only use the term lie in the most extreme of circumstances. Otherwise, you devalue the currency.
OK, well, I mean, to talk about, I have seen the clip many, many times, and it's obvious that...
Have you seen the original
Yes,
speech
the original,
and the two
absolutely.
clips
And
that
it is deliberately edited together to create a misimpression that Donald Trump is advocating for violence.
You say it's deliberately edited together, but there are other. Somebody like Adam Bolton, for instance, says that that you can have an interpretation of what was shown that doesn't make you end up thinking it was deliberately edited together to give a false impression.
Well, they cut away 15 minutes of
all
footage.
We can do, I would like to look at this. You may be right. You may be right.
Well, here it's playing right now. And what you see there is one clip is essentially saying he's saying go out peacefully, and the other piece is saying fight, 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 and implying violence. That for me is a lie.
I know that. Ostensibly, from what I have read, yes, it was certainly a grave error, and it was a grave misinterpretation of what Trump said ostensibly. But I'm not going to go as far as you, because I haven't looked at it myself. And perhaps I shouldn't have come on the programme tonight.
No, I think it's great you come on the programme. Seriously, Michael, because genuinely, going back to what you're saying about opinions and bias, you're right. I have an opinion on it. I think it's a lie. You are here. You don't think it's, or you need to research it further. That's totally fair enough. And that's the purpose of having balance and people at home. The idea is, of course, that they can make their own judgment and even do their own research. But surely another part of the problem is that the BBC has been marking its own homework. When we make a mistake and when our bias gets the best of us and we don't follow the rules of Ofcom, that's where the complaints process happens. But with the BBC, when that mistake happened, and I'm sorry, I disagree in terms of I think my bias is I think it's happened a lot more, but at least, then they start marking their own homework. Do you think that is a problem?
Well, there are internal investigations, but there's nothing to stop people referring the BBC to Ofcom over this as well.
Yeah, but it goes always to the internal procedures. But even if you go to Ofcom, they will then refer it back to Ofcom, internal BBC procedures.
You place an amazing amount of faith in Ofcom. I've totally lost faith. I think Ofcom are an utterly useless body, and the reason why is because they allow extraordinary bias to occur on your channel. So I wouldn't put them. Let's have an investigation by the Parliamentary Select Committee or an independent inquiry, sure, or Ofcom if they're going to do it properly. And I have spent a large part of my journalistic career as a broadcaster fighting bias at the BBC and at Channel 4 News, and whistleblowers often don't end up being lauded for it. So I think when it comes to attacking me over this, I think I've got a pretty good record, and I think it's important before one makes judgments to actually look at the original material. And too often debates take place in the media about what people have said in books or done on television screens without properly looking at them and looking at the background.
OK, well, look, Michael, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure genuinely talking to you and disagreeing with you. That's the point. And also, nice to see you've got very clean hands and nails there at the front. So let's go to a statement now with Kemi Badenoch. She said Tim Davie and Deborah Turnus had finally taken responsibility, but that a catalogue of serious failures at the BBC runs far deeper. The Tory leader said in a statement on X, it's right that Tim Davie and Deborah Turnus have finally taken responsibility and resigned from the BBC. But let's be honest, this has been a catalogue of serious failures that run far deeper. The culture at the BBC has not changed. BBC Arabic must be brought under urgent control. The BBC's US and Middle East coverage needs a full overhaul. And on basic matters of biology, the corporation can no longer allow its output to be shaped by a cabal of ideological activists. The new leadership must now deliver genuine reform of the culture of the BBC top to bottom, because it should not expect the public to keep funding it through a compulsory licence fee unless it can finally demonstrate true impartiality. Plus, we have breaking news. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, who has simply said, shot and chaser. So I am joined in the studio now by the journalist and Middle East expert, Jonathan Sacerdoti, and founder of Uncommon Sense, Lee Taylor. Welcome to the show, both of you. Thank you. Start with you, Jonathan. Now, you were sitting next to me during the interview there. It was, I think, a good-natured debate, but it was hard for me to concentrate because you were tutting so much.
Sorry, that's my Tourette's. What can I say? I mean, Look, the point is, GB News was accused in that interview of getting away with bias and Ofcom not giving you a hard enough time. But the very fact that you had him on is exactly filling your obligations under the Ofcom regulations. In fact, I'm sure that's why your producers booked him and let him talk so long. And that's fine. The point about the BBC is there's a big difference. People are forced to pay for it. And so when I hear people saying, well, GB News has a bias, the Telegraph has a bias, the Mail has a bias, if you don't like their bias, you don't put your hands in your pocket and buy them or pay for them or watch them. Whereas the BBC forces people to pay for it. And the point is that the BBC has inbuilt bias. It might be conspiracy, it might be groupthink. There was a freedom of information request some years ago in the early 2000s about how many newspaper subscriptions the BBC had for each newspaper. It had at that time 200 subscriptions for The Guardian, and every other newspaper, especially right-leaning ones, had around 50 or fewer. This is just one example of why such groupthink sets in a place like that. It's institutional rot and it's institutional capture. So even if the people at the top, it's great that Tim Davie and Deborah Turness have resigned and taken responsibility, and I take my hat off to them for that. I hope they're also not going to get their fat pensions as a result of this, because they have basically overseen a period, at least in the last 2 years, for people who cared about the truth in the Middle East, which I talk about, of calumnies about Israel, of twisted lies and falsities, which, you know, some people might say were mistakes, but after you make enough mistakes, even if we give them the benefit of the doubt, they're rubbish. They're a rubbish news channel. The BBC is a pathetic news institution. It pumps out ideology in a number of areas, and the Prescott memo or report, or whatever you want to call it, simply shows that it comes across many different topics and issues, that it was raised internally in the BBC many times. I know they knew about it before the Prescott report, because I've written investigative pieces on the BBC. In 2021, I wrote about BBC Arabic. Camera Arabic, the fantastic organisation, translates a lot of the rubbish that they put out. They have guests, they have people working there who have records online on their social media of anti-Semitism and ridiculous, outrageous anti-Israel bias, and they still hire them and still put them on hundreds of times on that channel. People who say things like, you know, they should do to Israel what Hitler did to the Jews, or they should burn like Hitler did to the Jews, or people who celebrated October the 7th, a horrific, barbaric Islamic jihadist attack on Israel simply for being a Jewish and free state. The BBC really should hang its head in shame, and the resignation of these two people is not enough. It's absolutely not enough. It needs to go all the way down. All the people who lied or failed or made mistakes underneath them need to be swept out by whoever takes their place. The idea that two new people in these roles could do a better job, we know the kind of people that will get put into those roles. It will be more of the same, more people who embody the bias and the prejudice that is so endemic in the BBC and has been for decades, not just now, not just in the last 2 years, not just on Israel, not just on trans, not just on the environment, not just on Brexit, not just on the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump. On virtually every topic, they take a left-leaning or far-left view. They pump it out to the nation as if it's consensus. They try to re-educate the nation, and it's time that stopped. And thank goodness for channels like GB News, because at the beginning of this 7th of October war, I sat right over there next to Nigel Farage, and he allowed me to read out sections of the Hamas Charter, which preached for the death and killing of Jews. That is in the Hamas founding charter. The BBC would never have let me do that.
They won't even call them terrorists.
Well, I didn't even get a chance to do it on the BBC, despite them calling me for many years as an expert on Israel. Do you know when they stopped calling me? October the 7th, 2023. They didn't call me once since then. Their call. They have every right to decide who they invite. But until that date, they considered me to be an expert on the topic. After that date, they didn't. It's very clear that whether it's by design, or whether it's by accident, or whether it's by institutional capture, the BBC represents a monolithic opinion that leans left on virtually every topic. Nothing wrong with that if they want to make it on their own. If they want to get people to pay for it commercially, they are not offering anymore a service that isn't offered elsewhere commercially, and better. This channel is outperforming the BBC because people value what's happening on this channel, whether you like the political slant or not of some of the shows and the presenters. GB News is consistently beating, in certain times, on viewing figures, BBC News, and that should tell you everything you need to know. This channel is small compared to the BBC, this massive beast with the massive resources and the limitless access to cash, our cash, which is not challenged by pressure groups or commercial bodies or efforts to try and boycott advertisers like happened to this channel. They don't have to deal with any of that. So when they made a documentary, for example, about children in the Gaza Strip, and they accidentally put on air an entire documentary narrated by the son of a minister in the Gaza Strip who was part of the Hamas government, when they did that and paid his family, a Hamas-linked family, and they put on another child in that documentary.
Our money.
Right, the British people's money. But there were other problems in that documentary that people aren't talking about. There was the non-sequential editing, exactly what they've been shown to have done to Donald Trump. They edited a whole section captioned with the day of the war it was meant to represent, and they then had a whole sequence of a child who was 9 or 10 or 11 who they said was a volunteer paramedic. I mean, a child of that age. Nonsense. This is typical Palestinian
Some people would argue that's
propaganda.
A mistake.
And, well, even if it was a mistake, it shows a dreadful, shameful level of journalistic instinct. Like when Jeremy Bowen said that the Al Ahli hospital had been flattened, and then you get people like that saying, well, they couldn't have journalists there. The BBC had their Gaza journalist in Gaza on October the 7th. He lived there. He chose to leave Gaza during the early weeks of the war. So the BBC of all channels has no leg to stand on when they say that Israel wouldn't let them have their journalists in Gaza. They had one, and he left. The point here is that Jeremy Bowen should have looked at those videos of the Al Ahli hospital, as I did. I cover this area of the world, and I could see that it wasn't an Israeli strike. My instinct told me from covering previous wars in Gaza and previous Israeli military action that it was most likely a misfired rocket from the Palestinians, as it turned out to be. My instinct told me that from the videos we couldn't see that the hospital had been, what Bowen said, flattened.
500 dead, supposedly.
The car park had a pothole from a misfired Palestinian rocket. So even if it was a mistake, which Jeremy Bowen then went on to say he didn't regret at all, he said that on the record, this shows a low level of journalistic ability. That from one of the BBC's highest paid correspondents and veteran correspondents of that region. It shows that whether it's deliberate or not, I don't care. They've been doing this for decades. They have been taking the British public and the world for fools in expecting us to believe the propaganda that they pump out. That documentary did the same as was done to Donald Trump with non-sequential editing of that child. They pretended scenes recorded on different days happened on the same day, and you could see from the child's hair length that that was the case. No, the BBC needs a clean sweep. This is an opportunity for them to get someone in who will really get rid of this institutional rot and turn it around so that it could be what it should be, a channel that does the difficult work that commercial channels maybe can't because of pressure groups, commercial pressures from advertisers and from protest groups. The BBC could stand up against all of the Free Palestine Brigade who go out onto the streets and call for jihad, or who go out onto the streets and call for intifada, which is terrorism. They could stand up against all that and put the truth on there, but they're not doing that.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to interrupt you because I just want to see if you would beat Leo and his start right there. So, look, Lee, I mean, you work within advertising. Do you think actually in a weird, ironic way that advertising could actually help the BBC? Commercial pressures might, the free market might get them to sort themselves out, or
The
not?
free market sorts out a lot of problems, and so the more free market, the better. But we've talked a lot about the news output today. I just think genuinely the BBC output's poor. I mean, they overrepresent minorities all the time. You can't watch an episode of Gardener's World without being told that climate change is apocalyptical and we're all going to die. The whole output needs to be opened up to the free market.
Half of the episode, half of all TV seems to involve drag queens.
Exactly, yeah. But if you put the free market to that and you allow advertisers to say whether they're going to buy it or not, then you'll really find out whether the output that they're putting out is useful and being watched, because views, and if they're not getting views, they won't pay.
I mean, obviously, the BBC was set up. The point was actually to provide some programmes that were safe from the free market, that just relied on quality. That hopefully there were sitcoms, for example, that would be created that weren't necessarily successful, but then because they were given that space in a sort of commercial-free environment, that they could kind of grow. Like if you look at The Office, first season wasn't successful particularly, but it got the space for another season and then repeats, and it was allowed to expand. Do you think that the BBC could in any way be safe? Do you think the problems culturally go beyond just the news part of it?
Completely. The culture, I'm sure the whole of the BBC is ideologically captured, right from the bottom all the way to the top, so it won't just be the news. But back to your point of, if we were talking 20 years ago, then 100% it gives an opportunity to people like Ricky Gervais, who has made an absolute fortune and a fantastic show from The Office. I mean, you could argue that they sold The Office abroad and they would have made a lot of money back from that, regardless of advertising or not. But there could certainly be an opportunity for that. But I just think what we've got at the moment and the banal, biased institution, it's like it's not worth saving the tiny bits of good that it does do. I'd say bulldoze the whole thing, open it up to the free market and see how well they perform.
Really? Well, I mean, you were sort of nodding away there. Do you think? Because I mean, maybe call me, naive, call me an optimist. I still have faith somehow because whether the rot goes deeper than the news, or whether it can culturally be saved, because I guess I sort of am still beholden to these kind of Reithian ideals of educate and
Yeah,
inform.
you are, but no one at the BBC is. When did they last produce something like The Office? When did they last do any of the things you said they're there to do? What I was saying about that documentary is if they'd wanted to make a documentary about children in Gaza, for example, they could have made a brilliant one about how Hamas and other Palestinian jihadist groups abuse children by making them pretend to be paramedics or making them pretend to be poor, innocent little children who aren't connected to a Hamas family. Of course children are innocent, but the real abuse of children in the Gaza Strip or by Hamas is that they force them into these sort of
propaganda movies, carrying cans of water.
Right.
Where are the adults? He's like, they're carrying cans of water. You're like, there's an adult there with an iPhone. You pick up the can of water.
The Bild magazine, the German publication, literally revealed the photographs of the photographer taking the photographs of the people holding these pots and pans waiting for food, showing that it was staged. They had aerial shots showing that it was staged and that nearby life was more normal. I'm not trying to say there wasn't suffering in Gaza. I'm trying to say that the BBC had access to all the same sources you and I had. I couldn't get into the Gaza Strip either, but I knew that what they were putting out over the last 2 years was predominantly biased. When they went and said these, 14,000 babies would die of starvation in the next 2 days, you didn't need a journalist in Gaza to think. Now, that sounds like a massive and inconceivable number that are going to drop dead in 2 days because of a famine that hasn't happened and might not. And it turns out didn't. That's what the latest figures have shown, even from the bodies that have no reason to be pro-Israel. So the BBC, in my opinion, is not doing any of the things you said it should.
Absolutely. Well, look, that is the end of the first hour on Free Speech Nation as the BBC Director General resigns from the organisation over a series of scandals. Don't go away. There is a lot more to come between now and 9 o'clock as we unpack this breaking news. See you in a couple of minutes.
We could be delivering the perfect Christmas to you this year. There's £30,000 in tax-free cash to make 2026 the best year yet. A further £10,000 cash to spend on gifts for all the family. There's £1,000 to spend in your favourite supermarket. And a festively themed GB News goodie bag. And we'll get it all to you in time for the big day. For another chance to win, text WIN to 63225. One entry costs £2.50 plus one standard network rate message. Or text bonus to 63225. 5 entries cost £5 plus one standard network rate message. Go to gbnews.com/win. Entries start at £2.50. Call 0903 686 3232. Calls cost £2.50 plus your network access charge. Or post your name and number to GB 17 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 4 p.m. on the 28th of November. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Hi, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and my show is your opportunity to cut through all the noise and dive in headfirst to some robust debates. Ideas clash.
Situation,
No,
isn't it?
no,
Because the failure is
you're deliberately avoiding my point. Nothing's held back,
And if you think this is the end of it, wait for more.
and we do not shy away from the difficult stuff.
Sometimes I want to shake people and say, if only you understood.
So join me on Jubes and Kerr weeknights at 6 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Britain was once the envy of the world. But look around. A nation that no longer knows what it is or where it's going. A country that's broken. How do we fix Britain? How do we bring it back? Friday night with Matt Goodwin at 8 p.m. only on GB News.
Mornings don't have to be tiresome, especially if you have the right company.
Wake up to news as it happens, opinion and debate, and of course, a little bit of entertainment too.
Because when the kettle's on, we're on.
That's Breakfast on GB News, a show worth waking up for.
Every morning from 6 a.m.
Only on the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We'll spread the news, you spread the word.
No matter the state it's in, this is our nation. Join me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, for a genuine, honest discussion on where we have been, where we are going, and where we are with the people who set the direction. Tune in to State of the Nation every Monday to Thursday, 8 to 9 o'clock. Only on GB News.
At GB News, we love to hear from you, our loyal community. So drop us a line at gbnews.com/yoursay. There you can talk to each other and also to the presenters live on air. gbnews.com/yoursay, because GB News is your channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Free Speech Nation with me, Josh Howie, where it is all go, go, go. It's an extraordinary night of breaking news. Tim Davie, the Director General of the BBC, has announced resignation this evening amid allegations of bias at the corporation. In a statement, Davie says, "There have been some mistakes made, and as a General Director, I have to take ultimate responsibility. The move comes following a torrid week for Britain's national broadcaster after it was accused of airing a doctored clip of the speech by President Trump and failing in its coverage of Gaza and trans issues. Deborah Turness, the broadcaster's CEO of News, has also resigned. In a message posted on social media, Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy said, "I want to thank Tim Davie for his service to public broadcasting over many years. He has led the BBC through a period of significant change and helped the organisation to grip the challenges it has faced in recent years. The BBC is one of our most important national institutions. Every day it tells the story of who we are, the people, places and communities that make up life across the UK. Now, more than ever, the need for trusted news and high-quality programming is essential to our democratic and cultural life and our place in the world. As a government, we will support the board as it manages this transition and ensures that the Charter Review is the catalyst that helps the BBC to adapt to this new era and secures its role at the heart of national life for decades to come." Kemi Badenoch said Tim Davie and Deborah Turness had finally taken responsibility, but that a catalogue of serious failures at the BBC runs far deeper, the Tory leader said in a statement on X. "It's right that Tim Davie and Deborah Turness have finally taken responsibility and resigned from the BBC, but let's be honest, this has been a catalogue of serious failures that runs far deeper. The culture at the BBC has not yet changed. BBC Arabic must be brought under urgent control. The BBC's US and Middle East coverage needs a full overhaul, and on basic matters of biology, the corporation can no longer allow its output to be shaped by a cabal of ideological activists. The new leadership must deliver now genuine reform of the culture of the BBC, top to bottom, because it should not expect the public to keep funding it through a compulsory licence fee unless it can finally demonstrate true impartiality." And in a statement on X, Nigel Farage has said Davie and Turness going must be the start of wholesale change. The government need to appoint somebody with a record of coming in and turning companies and cultures around. Preferably, it would be someone coming in from the private sector who has run a forward-facing business and understands PR. This is the BBC's last chance. If they don't get it right, there will be vast numbers of people refusing to pay the licence fee. So I am now joined by the Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Nigel Huddleston. Nigel, welcome to the show. We've just read out Lisa Nandy's statement there. She's right, I think, personally, on what the BBC represents, how it's our great sort of cultural institution. But do you agree with the idea that it's just a couple of problems, that it can be solved?
No, I'm afraid the volume of complaints, the volume of criticisms, the multiple examples of bias make this a much bigger issue than a couple of one-offs. These things did not happen by accident. These were deliberate editorial decisions by journalists and editors to put things out that put words in people's mouths, that misinterpreted comments, or indeed were straightforwardly biased. So there's something systematically wrong here. So I think Tim Davie was right to go because the buck stops at the top.
So it stops at the top, but do you think that it can actually be salvaged?
I do. I mean, to the extent that the BBC is a long-established global institution, something that we used to be all very proud of, because it was based on trust and confidence in its impartial news coverage. The problem is there are too many examples now of that impartiality being sideswiped. And that's against both the Charter, but also the editorial guidelines of the BBC, which is why I say there's something quite cultural and systematic here. People have allowed this to happen, and then reviews have happened and no action has been taken. So serious moves need to be taken here. We want the BBC to thrive. We want the BBC to do very well, but it can only do so based on confidence and trust and impartiality. And I'm afraid that has been lost recently. So there is an opportunity to build it back. But if they don't, then no surprise, licence payers, taxpayers, might move with their feet before there's any government action here. I mean, I think we all know lots of people who are giving up their licence fees already because they don't like the BBC. That needs to stop, but it can only do so with rebuilding that trust and confidence.
Well, you've mentioned trust twice, and I agree that seems to be the fundamental, most important factor here. Your former leader, Boris Johnson, he said that he would refuse to pay the licence fee. Many other people, as you point out, have already stopped paying the licence fee. What do you think it's going to take to rebuild that trust then? Because the resignation of two senior executives, I think you also correctly identified the problem is a cultural issue. How do you actually get to grips with that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. Just changing the leadership will not solve the problems. It needs to be much deeper. And this is why there are perfectly fair and reasonable accusations of institutional bias here. I genuinely don't believe that some of the people at the BBC know that they are biased in the coverage. That is the definition of institutionalism. They surround themselves with people who think like them, believe the same things. Therefore, having a go at Donald Trump or being very anti-Israel is perfectly fair and reasonable. That is not consistent with impartiality, which is why it really needs to fundamentally change. Now, as I said, the BBC does a lot. It does a lot of good programming. It does a lot more than news and current affairs. But the real problems do seem to be in the news and current affairs coverage. And this is now the examples given in that really long letter to the board the other day. I mean, I read it and I was horrified by it. You know, I'd heard of some of them, but when you read example after example of bias, it really is a horrible situation. The BBC needs to change. And whoever the new DG is, they need to get a grip and get a grip quickly. And we want them to succeed. But at the problem, the BBC is its own worst enemy.
Yeah, I mean, you know, those examples, I read the same thing. But, you know, we've covered those examples on this show and on this channel for the last few years. And, yeah, when you read it like that, and you also, I think, when you read it in a period of near sanity and you read some of the things that happened before, it seems even more insane. But they didn't seem to take notice at the time. Those complaints that went through, they weren't acted upon, they weren't listened to. Surely part of the problem, and I keep on bringing this up, but is that the BBC marks its own homework.
Yes, you're making a really important point there. And these are the things that we're looking at as part of our policy renewal process, because, you know, the BBC, an important institution, public service broadcasting overall, is something that we care about, we care deeply about. But it is based on these principles of fairness and honesty and trust. And if the BBC breaks that, then the whole system, the charter comes into question, the licence fee comes into question. But it is pervasive. This is not a one-off. And I think as well, you know, this is why Tim Davie had to go, because he's recognised that he probably knew about some of these things, was made aware of them, and was unable to change. So whoever comes in now has an awesome responsibility, and I really do mean that. It's not going to be an easy job to really make that change meaningful now, because otherwise that trust will disappear.
I agree with you. You know, there are people who, as the furore is built up over the last week, will say that there's this kind of right-wing conspiracy to bring down the BBC, to destroy the BBC. It seems like you, and as a representative of the Conservative Party, that isn't your intention. I mean, I know this is a ridiculous question almost to, even if it was true, you wouldn't answer. But what do you think about these ideas that, it's, the right wing are out to get the BBC, to destroy the BBC? Because the way that you're speaking about the BBC, I personally agree with, which is that ideally I would like it to be fixed. I would like that trust to be re-established.
Yeah, if the BBC didn't exist, there'd be something missing in the UK's broadcast ecosystem. And of course, with its local radio or Strictly or all sorts of things, there's a lot of things to admire about the BBC. But it's this news and current affairs that keeps being the problem area. We don't want to destroy the BBC. We want the BBC to be the best version of itself. We want it to be that ethical, that trusted source for news and current affairs that it used to be. We don't want to see it destroyed. But given that it is based on license fee paying money, they've got to listen to the license fee payers. And they're not all right-wing people, by the way, complaining about the BBC. When you look at that example, the discipline of Martin Croxall for correcting pregnant people to women, that's not a left and right political spectrum thing. I've had constituents who voted Labour and other parties come to me and say that was ridiculous. This is not a right-wing issue. This is an issue about a pervasive culture that transcends left and right. It just isn't common sense. The BBC, I'm afraid, has lost touch with common sense British public. It's not the traditional right-left political spectrum, though, believe me, there's plenty of examples of that. But also other things like you don't deliberately and consciously doctor a speech for the former and potential future president of the United States. That goes beyond left-right. That is terrible. The comments being made now by the US and the president of the United States about the BBC are really disheartening. He's saying something about a beloved British institution, but the problem is he's right, because they doctored a speech, irrespective of whether you're on the right or the left. That's not on. If that was Kamala Harris, if that was somebody else, it's just not on. And I say this is the problem here. There's something really quite pervasive. We've got to get back to having a trusted institution with very, very trusted, honest, straightforward news coverage.
Yeah, well, that's it. I guess the framing would be it's about politically left and right, and I totally agree with you. These issues that have been talked about, these that have been exposed, the pregnant women, only women can have babies. That's not a left or right issue, and actually many of the leading proponents of pushing against this gender ideology have been people on the left.
Yeah.
As the Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, that's focused on the culture part of it, you identify that it's a cultural issue. What would you do? If you're in power right now, how do you get to and affect and change the culture within the BBC, change that kind of ideological capture? Is it possible?
I think we need a body, a group, to make sure that the BBC abides by its editorial guidelines and its charter, particularly on impartiality. That probably means an external body assessing. The problem is, as you identified earlier on, there's way too much of marking their own homework at the BBC that goes on. I think as well, in hiring practices, the BBC needs to look very carefully about who it hires, what kind of backgrounds, what kind of beliefs, what kind of political beliefs do they have as well. I've got many friends who work at the BBC or did work at the BBC, and they'll often say they were the only Tory in the room. That's not on. You can't have an environment that's meant to be covering news and current affairs where 80%, 90% of the people believe in one political view on the spectrum or another. So it's really important that they look at ways of changing. But I do think we need to look at the hierarchy of the BBC, the decision-making of the BBC, the way that impartiality is assessed. And that means, looking at the board and looking at the editorial guidelines and then making sure that they rigidly stick to them. And it should not be the BBC marking its own homework.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Nigel Huddleston. So I am joined now by the political commentator, Andy Williams. Andy, welcome to the show. Andy, what are your thoughts on today's news?
Well, look, I think the BBC has made mistakes, obviously, and particularly in this case with the footage of Donald Trump. I would say I'm not quite sure about the language here. The idea that this footage was doctored, I mean, that's incorrect. It was edited in a misleading way. Doctored sort of infers that the footage was sort of concocted or made up in some way. But in any case,
what about just a lie
about the President of the United States or the President-elect at the time? Now, clearly, Tim Davie, and I think, has made the right decision to fall on his sword, to be accountable for this, as has the chief executive of BBC News. But what I want to emphasise is that any threat to the BBC's long-term viability as a national broadcaster, the national broadcaster, should really worry people, because actually, more often than not, it is falling over itself to be impartial. And beyond the news, the BBC contributes an enormous amount culturally, socially, whether it's music, whether it's our local radio stations, our local news. The BBC is a massive net contributor in this country. We would really miss it if it was gone. And I think that Nigel Huddleston is, by the way, a politician who I like. I think he talked a lot of sense there. I think his leader, once again, has let herself down in a significant way with her ludicrous statement.
What aspect of it did you find was ludicrous?
You know, talking about a cabal of ideological activists. Well, there's nobody more ideological than Kemi Badenoch, and I think.
Well, sorry, one second. Sorry, what do you think? What do you think those ideologies are? That she thinks there are only two sexes. Would you say that's an ideology, or is that a fact?
Well, that's completely changing the subject.
What ideology do you think that she's like beholden to? Then you said that she's ideologically captured, or implied it. What ideologies specifically are you talking about?
Well, specifically, Kemi Badenoch's so completely beholden to the free market that the very idea of the BBC is anathema to her. Kemi Badenoch would much prefer a Britain that didn't have the BBC. She's pretty much on record as saying that. It's very, very clear. And I think she, like lots of politicians on the right over the last few years, have been consistently undermining the BBC with a view to getting to an end goal, and this is what Nigel Farage wants as well. They don't want the licence fee to exist anymore. Now, that may be a legitimate position, that's a legitimate political position, but it's one that I wholeheartedly disagree with. I think the licence fee is a good thing. I know that Boris Johnson is now talking about refusing to pay the licence fee, and if you want to know which way the wind is blowing, then look in the opposite direction of Boris Johnson, because the guy doesn't know what he's talking about.
I mean, he argued. Okay, it's not like he's not been right about some things. I mean, he certainly saw where that wind was going. But look,
well, look how that worked out.
Well, no, we can argue about that, but the point is, in terms of political wins, he certainly seemed to have his pulse at least on that time. And I think that on this case, what he has seen isn't necessarily coming from an ideological position of let's destroy the BBC, rather than, and even looking at Nigel Farage's statement just now, he's not saying let's destroy the BBC. What he's saying is let's give them another chance. Some people are already way beyond that point. They don't think the BBC should be given another chance for these failures. You know, we're talking about this one thing, and, you know, picking up on whether this footage is doctored. Well, I would argue that it was an outright lie, a misrepresentation of truth. Within that report that came out in the Telegraph, do you see that there are other failings, that there are other misrepresentations, omissions, or even outright lies?
Absolutely, I do. And I'm not dismissing every aspect of that report. Of course, there have been misrepresentations. And by the way, I'm not defending that change to the Donald Trump footage. I just think we need to be careful about our language there. I think it's really, really important that the BBC is held to account. And, you know, they do need to do better. Of course they do. But I think we need to be realistic about what an organisation as big as the BBC, how often, you know, they can't get it right 100% of the time. Of course they can't.
What percentage? Sorry, 1 second, because before you said they get it right more often than not. Well, that could be 55% of the time. What works for you in terms of their representation of truth? 80%, 90%?
No, much more than that. Look, the BBC is publicly funded, so of course it needs to get it right 98. Look, I'm not going to put a figure on it, but almost all of the time, of course it does. My point is that an organisation of that size with that level of output, sometimes they will get it wrong. And actually, if you look at a lot of the scandals we've been talking about over the last few years, take the MasterChef scandal, for example. You know, that was a production company that was putting out content on the BBC that massively failed in its duty of care to contestants and particularly to women. That was a massive, massive problem. They do get it wrong, and they definitely got it wrong in this case. And I think Tim Davies' right to resign. But let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Trust me, you would miss the BBC if it was gone. Maybe not all of your viewers would, but I think the vast majority of people in Britain would, because it produces content that nobody else can produce and nobody else would produce without that licence fee, which is absolutely integral.
Oh, well, thank you very much for joining us as a political commentator, Andy Williams. Thank you, Andy. Joining me now to discuss this in the studio is the historian Lawrence Goldman. Lawrence, welcome to the show. We can have a round of applause for Lawrence. He's right here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lawrence, you were booked before Tim Davies resigned because, and to explain this story, in 2022, you, with a bunch of other historians, you're a worldwide, world-renowned expert historian, and you went to the BBC and you said, hi, I think you're misrepresenting some history, some facts here, and they kind of fobbed you off, right?
Yeah, they fobbed us off. We produced a report. We looked at programmes, broadcasts between 2020 and 2022, news bulletins as well. We picked out historical errors, lack of objectivity, inaccuracy, bias and ideological slant.
Would you mind just telling us one or two examples?
Yeah, several were about the history of slavery. One was on the Bengal famine of 1943.
Blaming Winston Churchill.
Blaming Winston Churchill and accusing him of being a racist. Another, perhaps the worst of them, was on the Irish famine of the late 1840s. And in all these cases, there were distortions. There was the presentation of a view in what is a contested field when there are lots of different interpretations, and there wasn't enough focus on the facts. Where slavery was concerned, for example, viewers were not told that there were other European nations involved in slave trading, and indeed that Africans themselves were always the first stage of the slave trade process. Africans enslaved Africans and then sold them to Europeans. Those kinds of facts were never explained to people.
To push forward an ideology that it's just the British who are uniquely evil.
It was, and we were uniquely evil, and then that very remarkable aspect of our history, that we became the lead nation in the history of anti-slavery, in suppressing and ending the slave trade, and indeed ending slavery all over the 19th century world. That was left out
at
as
a great
well.
cost financially and also of life.
Yes, it's estimated that something like 1,600 sailors in the Royal Navy died in the process of manning the West African squadron and patrolling the Atlantic and trying to end the trade in slaves. And the cost, well, it ran to millions even in the 19th century. The West African squadron was at sea from about 1810, 1811, all the way through to the 1860s.
That's like billions now. That's like a couple of Chagos Islands.
Absolutely. It was a great act of kind of, you know, humanitarian concern. Similarly, I mean, one could go on with the way the BBC presented it. We then attempted, in various ways, to end slave trading among African nations, and indeed also to end human sacrifice. And they presented that in a very mealy-mouthed kind of way. There are certain events in Benin and other places which they mangled, whether deliberately or not.
So, OK, so these are some examples here. You went to the BBC, you said, hey, we're pretty world expert-y on all this stuff. And you presented this information in a very sort of polite manner. Now, this is where the problem comes in, because organisations make mistakes. Also, organisations have arguably, you know, biases as well, of course. But their response, that seems to be the problem. This is 2022. You went to them, you said, guys, you know, maybe you should have a look at this because you're not doing your job properly. Let's talk about their response.
Yes, well, if I may just explain, Michael Prescott, in that dossier that has been leaked, actually said we made very sensible and reasonable and moderate points. We didn't scream at them, we didn't shout. We said, look, there are factual errors here in the way that you're presenting British history. You can do better. And we suggested ways in which they might do it better. But they fobbed us off. Apparently, there was some plan that they might meet. One BBC employee might meet with us to discuss it, but then they changed their mind, and we never had that discussion. And we put forward some ideas. We suggested that there might be a broad panel of historians who could be contacted when they were making programmes and asked for their opinions. And we weren't trying to impose one ideological line. We simply wanted them to use the best people. And that, I think, is our most important point from 2022. We said, you're not using the best people. You're not going to the experts. You're not dealing with people who spent a lifetime in academic research actually dealing with these problems and these questions. There are better people. And I would say this, in the old days, the BBC actually did find who those people were and worked with them. More recently, it seems to me, in the presentation of history and in other subjects, they've tended to go to people whose line on a question they would approve of, they could rely on. And so the viewer, the millions of viewers, are not actually getting the best. And that surely was what the BBC should have represented, the best.
Absolutely, of course, a meritocracy. That's why I got this job. So, you know, so then they kind of fobbed you off, and then I'm assuming they've made further historical inaccuracies that could have been.
We did that particular thing. History Reclaimed runs a big website, and we tried to correct some of the mistakes that are made, not just by the BBC, but by other historians and other media outlets. And we tried to present history as it should be presented. And we have lots of eminent historians writing for us because there is a great concern in the historical profession that people are not being fed the truth. So we didn't spend all our time pursuing the BBC. We kind of gave it up as a bad business. And then the Prescott report was leaked last week. And how exciting for us, and for the young man who actually compiled that report for us, that actually we had made an impact. A page of the 19 is about the way history has been presented.
That's a great point, because we're talking here, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of focus on the President Trump. Now, I would call it a lie. Some people would call it a mistake. But also of trans issues, also on Gaza, Israel. But this particular topic just proves how ideology went deeper than that, even to history, and I imagine into other academic subjects as well.
Well, I think history is very important in all of this, because...
Well, you would.
Yeah, well, yes, but he who controls the past controls the future, as Orwell said. It's very important that, you know, if you can present history in a particular kind of way, if you can trash Winston Churchill's reputation, if you can call him a racist, if you can blame the British for the Bengal famine and the Irish famine, then, in a sense, you're involved in really quite a sinister ideological position and plot to undermine this country and its culture. It's a very serious matter. So history has to be kept clean and decent and honest, and that's what a number of historians have been trying to do. But I don't think the BBC has been as committed to that as it should be. And I would just say this, go back 20 or 25 years, and actually historians were really very complimentary about the way the BBC dealt with national history. Interestingly enough, in 2000, or 2004 it was, Winston Churchill, on a BBC poll, was voted the greatest Briton of all time. But it's in the past 20 years, perhaps even the past 10 years, that things have gone very wrong. And for myself, I think it's about the way the BBC has hired staff and the kinds of people who are now making programmes and working in the newsroom.
Absolutely. Well, we'll see if it can be fixed with just these two resignations. Thank you very much for joining us. That's the historian, Professor Lawrence Goldman. Ooh, they like you, Lawrence. So, you are watching Free Speech Nation with me, Josh Howie. As a reminder, here is that breaking news tonight from the BBC. Tim Davie, the Director General of the BBC, has announced his resignation this evening amid allegations of bias at the corporation. In a statement, Davie says, "There have been some mistakes made, and as Director General, I have to take ultimate responsibility." The move comes following a torrid week for Britain's national broadcaster after it was accused of airing a doctored clip of a speech by President Trump and failing in its coverage of Gaza and trans issues, and as we just found out, history issues. Deborah Turnus, the broadcaster's CEO of News, has also resigned. Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy said, "I want to thank Tim Davie for his service to public broadcasting over many years. He has led the BBC through a period of significant change and helped the organisation to grip the challenges it has faced in recent years." Kemi Badenoch said Tim Davie and Deborah Turnus had finally taken responsibility, but that a catalogue of serious failures at the BBC runs far deeper. So I am joined now by the media lawyer, Jonathan Cohen. Jonathan, welcome to the show. Is this news a surprise for you at all?
Well, it isn't. And I've been speaking on other broadcasters. And I said a couple of days ago that I thought this was bigger than the Jimmy Savile disaster, which you'll recall John Simpson saying was the biggest problem to hit the BBC for 50 years. And I said, well, I think this is bigger because here you've got the BBC, a cultural institution which, you know, how many years old it is, and it's really part of our national identity, lying to us. And there was a debate earlier, I've been watching your coverage, which, if I may say, was excellent. And you had a discussion with a gentleman earlier on about the issue of whether the footage was doctored. Well, of course it was doctored. And I was speaking as a media lawyer, and I've legaled out television programmes for 30 years under the Ofcom rules, which incidentally say broadcasters must avoid unjust or unfair treatment of individuals or organisations in programmes. Now, that footage was doctored. There's no other word for it, to give a particular impression of Donald Trump. Now, I'm going off slightly your question, but to suggest that these are just mistakes is also not true. I mean, everything that you see from the BBC, particularly Panorama, because I've worked around Panorama, and I'm working with two ex-Panorama people on a book at the moment. Lawyers are all over it. You cannot get something out on Panorama unless it's very carefully considered. Now, to describe this editing as a mistake just doesn't do it justice. And it reminds me a little bit of, I was trying to think what it reminded me of, a little bit like the Duke of York as he was on Emily Maitlis. And the problem that he had is that he simply wouldn't show contrition. And I think the BBC's problem at the moment is just not showing genuine contrition. It isn't just Donald Trump, and as most of your contributors have rightly said, there is an institutional problem. And clipping the two heads off it isn't going to deal with it. And until the BBC admits that it has an institutional problem, a little bit like you'll remember when after the Stephen Lawrence murder investigation went badly wrong. There was an independent investigation. It was determined that the Metropolitan Police was institutionally racist. Now, that is the problem with the BBC. As someone who's a supporter of the BBC, it is an institutional problem. I've acted for people with the BBC. I've worked with the BBC. There is absolutely no doubt that there is a particular worldview which is prevalent in the BBC and which has now fed into most of its factual coverage. And someone earlier on rightly quoted the Charter. Well, this is paragraph 1 of the BBC Charter. To provide impartial news and information. So right at the core, ever since, Lord Reith set it up, the obligation of the BBC to us as people that fund it, but also it represents us internationally. And for that reason, it has a huge responsibility, because if our national broadcaster is telling lies, which it was in doctoring that Trump view and telling lies about the Gaza war, which undoubtedly it was, then it is failing in its most basic obligation, which is to provide impartial news and information. And if it's not doing that, then it's got a fundamental problem. And until that's admitted, I don't think there's any solution in sight.
Davies says there's been some problems, some incidents, implies that it is on a smaller scale, then even at that point there's no real embracing of the reality of the issues there. Now, you mentioned an inquiry, independent inquiry, the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. Do you think that that could be something that would work here, an independent inquiry into the BBC to show and prove so that there isn't this way that they can just kind of mark themselves and pretend that there isn't this deeper problem?
Well, the BBC does mark its own homework, and the intention behind that was historically to keep it independent. Now, the problem is that works fine as long as it's fundamentally doing its job, which is to provide impartial news. But the problem then arises, an independent organisation which lacks accountability if it's not doing that. Now, one of the big issues is who to replace Davey. Now, it surely must come from someone outside BBC, because there's a consensus, which I think is a right consensus, very much reflected by your programme, that it just isn't a few mistakes. And if the BBC is going to maintain it's just a few mistakes, then there's little hope for it. And I don't want it to be destroyed any more than Cami Badenoch. Whatever you think about her politics, I agree with every single word of her tweet. I don't want it to be destroyed. I don't want it to cease to exist as an institution. But if it's not doing what its most important job is, and I'm going to repeat it again, to provide impartial news and information, then if that's not being done, then it's very difficult to see how it can justify charging us all essentially a poll tax to watch it.
I mean, look, I agree. I don't want the BBC to finish either. I just want it to do its job. That's what and I think many other people feel exactly the same way. I'll happily pay the money if they were doing their job. Do you think that there's a possible solution in just if the news part of it is unsalvageable, to break it off and just have the news as a separate entity, and we then just have a licence fee for the rest of the BBC?
Well, I've been thinking about this because, I love the BBC. I've grown up with the BBC. I've been a media lawyer for 33 years or whatever. And often when I'm at dinner parties, because, I've sued the Fleet Street a lot, and I have to say that there's an awful lot of hypocrisy in Fleet Street, pointing the finger at the BBC about not telling us the truth. But I've said to people time and time again, if they ask me, where do I go for truly impartial, balanced news? And my answer was the BBC. Now, that started to change. And when I've been blogging about it, my first blog about which headed, the BBC cannot now be trusted on Gaza, I started with it. I say this with regret. Now, I think that the possibility is that that news needs to be separated. But your excellent historian contribution, I don't know whether history programmes will fall within news or not, but that was an outstanding contribution from someone who obviously speaks with authority and without bias. But what that tells you is the institutional, the world view of the BBC, and that's what it is. They have a world view about them. And that goes obviously clearly beyond news. Now, one other interesting thing, at least to me, is that I came across, I can't remember how I came across it, but there was a Jeremy Bowen documentary about 25 years ago. Bowen obviously being the one who's been leading on the Gaza war, and the one who said, astonishingly, despite what it says in the charter, well, I don't mind that I got it wrong about this hospital. I'm glad we said it anyway. Well, he's obviously forgotten.
Synagogues got burned down around the world because of it.
Yes. Well, I mean, it was an appalling breach of the charter. Now, what was clear in a programme that was a history programme, this is why I'm bringing the two together, is that it's evident, funnily enough, at the same time as I watched this, on holiday, I read a history of the last 100 years of the Israel-Palestine problem. So I just happened to be full of the history at the time. Now, the presentation which Jeremy Bowen gave was very different from this authoritative history, and it was clear that Jeremy Bowen had either went into this documentary or during the course of it had made a firm decision as to which side he was. Now, you cannot have a lead reporter of an issue as big as the Gaza war, which obviously has international ramifications, who's going into reporting it, having already decided which the good guys are and which the bad guys are, and all the way through the BBC coverage, it was clear that Israel was the bad guys and Hamas were the good guys. Now, whatever you think about that, you cannot have an institutional giver out of information which is telling us about a war as important as this, having already decided who the baddies are. That has to change.
Yeah, well, it's certainly the way that information then gets, of course, framed and put out to us. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. That is the media lawyer, Jonathan Code. Joining me now is the documentary maker, Malcolm Clark, and political commentator, Andy Twells. So Andy's here first. Hey, Andy, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I mean, you know, I had another show planned.
Well, last minute journalism.
But it's almost like when you work on a news channel, you've got to go with
things
the news.
happen, yeah.
Were you expecting this? Because because I've been sort of railing against the leadership, certainly, of the BBC and parts of its culture for so long, and they just seem to have deflected continuously, that I wouldn't have been surprised if they just tried to fob this off as well. But it seems like now is change coming?
So I didn't expect it to happen this soon, to be honest with you. I thought there were clearly going to be some inquiries made in Parliament with the Department of Culture, Media and Sport and their select committee in Parliament. I think he was actually called to give a statement to them tomorrow. I thought it would probably be in the fallout of that statement that he'd have to resign. But I think the more shocking thing is the chief exec of BBC News has also gone. You know, probably that most senior figure outside of the Director General's office who manages the BBC News service has gone. And I think it really does show that kind of change is probably coming, because oftentimes, you know, you'll see those kind of key figures remain just below senior management and just continue doing what they're doing. So I think change is coming. I mean, he was an appointment under the last Tory government. I think it'll be interesting to see how the current Labour government take the appointment process. But change is coming.
I mean, if it was put through if there is any sort of politics, and of course there's going to be politics involved in this decision, but maybe Labour are going to make a decision that's actually going to make it worse. If it's not to deal with these fundamental cultural issues within the BBC. I mean, we've had different commentators on the show this evening, and that's part of our remit and part of us being a part of Ofcom, is that we show different thoughts and opinions. What do you think? Do you think that this is just a mistake or a couple of mistakes, or do you think that actually it goes a bit deeper than that?
I think it's quite hard to call it an institutional problem, because the institution
That's the wrong answer.
I know, wrong answer. Sorry, guys. Apologies, audience. It's such a large organisation. You know, the local radio stations are separate to the World Service, which are separate to BBC Arabic, which are separate to the documentary team, which are separate to, you know, I could go on and on and on.
But culture spreads across that, though.
I mean, I think to an extent, but, you know, the BBC have done some fantastic journalism over the, you know, since they were created, and they continue to do it. I mean, they've also made some mistakes, as shown in this report. I don't think it is an organisational issue. I think there have been a few bad departments that have made fundamental mistakes. That needs to be fixed from the top. But I don't think it's an organisation-wide thing.
OK, well, if you say it's not, I mean, if it's not organisational, for me, this just breaks down to two things. I believe, different to you, this is my bias is that there is ideological capture that we have seen repeatedly, certainly to do with issues to do with trans stuff, to do with Gaza. But there's this other problem where, when we're talking about the organisation itself, this marking of its own homework, and how what we've repeatedly seen is people going to the BBC, going to the leadership and saying, hey, you guys messed up here and you did this, and kind of just being constantly rebuffed. Now, that is an institutional problem, surely.
Well, I think that's where the role of the regulator comes in. Ofcom. I think Ofcom haven't been funded properly to enforce a lot of the complaints that they've found. I mean, Ofcom and the BBC are two separate entities.
That's what I'm saying. So if it doesn't, but it doesn't go to Ofcom, because when complaints go, Ofcom refers it back to the BBC to mark its own homework. Would you agree that maybe that is part of this institutional failure?
I think part of it is, yes, but I think also the regulator do need more capacity and more resources to accurately enforce complaints across the board, whether it's, you know, ITV or BBC or any other channel for that matter. I think they do need more resources and more funding, so they're not having to outsource it to those that they see as trusted individuals. I think it is about resourcing the regulator, so you do have that clear independent regulator.
If Ofcom were given the necessary resources, you would be happy with this part of the BBC where it judges its own homework?
Well, I think there would be less reliance on that. to be honest. I think if they had that in-house talent, then they wouldn't have to rely on those parts of the charter.
Is there anything else that you would personally change? I mean, do you it sounds like you think it's, you know, the firing of these two people will make that difference. You don't think that there are any other deeper cultural issues?
I think, you know, the BBC has had to reform itself every 20 years as the way that we consume news and the way that we deliver news evolves. I think this will probably be the kind of Rubicon that they've crossed now to kind of prompt that reform, whether it's looking more at the way that they deal with new media and moving away from that traditional news media, you know, producer and journalist-led rather than management-led. I think we will see a fundamental change in the way that we deliver news under this new management, because, you know, now's the time.
So I'm assuming you very much want the BBC to stay intact, to stay as it is.
Well, I mean, I certainly want the BBC to remain the national broadcaster. I think with their Royal Charter and the history of the organisation, the way it's entrenched in so many of our British identity, you know, it's not just the news service. People forget it's, you know, Strictly Come Dancing on a Saturday and a Sunday night. You know, some of the, you know, breakfast television that you watch. You know, it's a key part of our culture. I like Strictly
Come Dancing, and I like Celebrity Traitors, but I just don't trust them to report on Gaza if they were putting that. That would be a strange episode of Celebrity Traitors if they did that. Anyway, thank you. We're going to get back to you in a second, but I'm joined now by the documentary maker Malcolm Clark. Malcolm, welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. So, again, you were booked in before the show, and you were booked in to talk about the BBC, and similar to myself, you yourself have worked for the BBC.
Yeah,
so,
in the good old days when it took facts seriously.
Well, this is what it comes down to. This is part of what we were just talking about here, but do you see the evidence of this cultural failure and it being systemic across the board?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, everyone's talking about the Trump issue, quite rightly. Friends who worked in Panorama in the past say it would never have passed muster the way that they re-edited the speech in the good old days. But it's not just the Trump edit or you know, re-edit. The evidence of complete capture is the number of LGBTQ activists. I mean, I think when they did a staff survey, didn't 8% of the BBC staff say that they were LGBTQ? I mean, they're completely unrepresentative.
Well, sorry, Malcolm, I just have to interrupt you. Please don't forget the plus. I just don't want anybody to get offended there, okay? Because you get in danger if you miss out the plus, you get in danger. You get in trouble. So yes, so 8%
did Ofcom take that seriously? Wasn't that Ofcom? Didn't they take that nonsense seriously?
No comment. So, so 8% of the staff there identify as LGBTQ+. Obviously, that doesn't seem to fit the British society in any way. What we've seen, and part of this report that came out in the Telegraph, is this evidence of this kind of the LGBTQ+ network having an influence on the output that then comes and is released to the British people.
I mean, it's starting. I mean, they make stuff which is completely unrepresentative and deceptive. And worse still, the LGBTQ+ staff group and BBC management work hand in hand with Stonewall and then this new LGBTQ diversity group that advises them. And they use that to filter all the content. So it's stuff that they make that's wrong. I don't know if you remember, the BBC churned out educational material for primary school kids.
Yeah, we talked about this earlier. But isn't it also about what they don't make? Because one of the, I think, shining moments of journalism on this show, Andrew Doyle, in March last year, he did an entire episode on the WPATH report as it was revealed. Now, the BBC, that is the greatest medical scandal of our time, right?
Absolutely. But it's more subtle than that. That's a brilliant and obvious example, but Andrew should be commended for pointing it out, but so should a journalist, let's say Kath Lang, who worked tirelessly within the BBC until she was basically forced to leave by bullying by the LGBTQ staff group. And Kath has been churning out stuff on Twitter, you should check her out, which exposes the insidious way that the staff group and BBC management skewed all its coverage of single-sex spaces, of the Supreme Court decision, of so-called health for trans kids, so-called trans kids. It's been insidious and it's been relentless. And so this idea...
Sorry, I just want to interrupt you. There's still, I believe there's still, because you identified earlier, there's a documentary all about sex changes. Of course, you can't change sex, but pushing this idea of puberty blockers, which are now illegal. Yet, am I right that that's still up on the BBC website?
It's 11 years old, this documentary, in which Leo, a girl who's been convinced that she's really a boy, she takes puberty blockers, and this 11-year-old documentary, when it was first broadcast, said this was brilliant, and she's getting a chance to take puberty blockers, and she's getting to express her deep inner identity. Now, look at how much the culture has changed in those 11 years. For one thing, both a Tory and a Labour government have banned these drugs. The cast reviews happen. There's been a complete cultural change about puberty blockers, and yet BBC Three, the youth channel of the BBC, still has this 11-year-old documentary celebrating puberty blockers on its YouTube site. I mean, it's outrageous, it's a scandal. And so that's why all these people talking about how the BBC, it's fine, they can just, have a bit of a tinker, and Tim Davies gone, it'll all change. Their entire news operation, their entire factual operation is needing radical root and branch reform. I'm not convinced that they can bring back the good old days where they took facts seriously. When I worked on Horizon, we went through so many levels of sourcing and double checking and questioning, and that's what's gone. In the old days, your boss at the BBC asked you searching questions. Can you really stand this up? Because they would be taken to what was then the Broadcasting Standards Commission, which is now morphed into Ofcom, which is relatively toothless. You lived in fear of a BSC investigation. I think Horizon got one investigation ever, and that was because we slightly suggested that Graham Hancock, that nut job scientist who thinks that we're all, human beings were created by aliens, we slightly suggested...
Sorry, I just have to say for Ofcom... Sorry, I just have to interrupt you. For Ofcom purposes, I have to say that... we were
He's not necessarily a lunatic.
Oh, I don't have to do that. Okay, fine, good. Well, look,
we got taken to BSC for hinting that he might not be absolutely respectable. Now they're re-editing Donald Trump speeches. I mean, the old days are gone.
Well, let's talk about that. I used to work for the BBC as well. How do you feel? I mean, you were someone, you dedicated decades to them. To see this ideological capture, I don't know about you, but I don't want to be out. I've campaigned in front of the BBC. I'll freely admit it. I am biased because I have seen the damage I believe that they have caused over the last few years with their ideological capture. But it makes me sad because I grew up believing in the BBC.
And I learned all my skills, which I now use on my Substack. I learned all my skills and fact-checking and really interrogating the truth from my mentors at the BBC, who I respected and admired and still do. And you can't help but love the old BBC as it was. I don't know if you ever went down to press cuttings where they kept cuttings of every single issue. It was like they basically invented the internet before it happened. And so everybody was driven by a desire to keep the public informed and to be trustworthy and to be fair and balanced. That's all been thrown out the window because now it's all about social justice and virtue signalling, which is a completely different, well, I say it's not a discipline, it's just a completely different attitude.
So when do you think ideology replaced truth, essentially, as a founding principle? Because that's the way it seems.
People forget, sort of, everyone's saying it's the right who are ganging up against the BBC. The bullying, the sort of neutering of the BBC began under Labour and under Blair. It was Alistair Campbell who got rid of the only truly popular Director General, Greg Dyke. He was independent and feisty and took the government on about the Iraq war, which we all now know and acknowledge was a huge mistake. He was forced out, so was management. And ever since then, which must have been, 2005, the BBC has been cowed. Very careful, worried that it won't get the licence fee renewal, and it happened with Labour. It started with Labour, it went under the Liberal Democrats and the coalition government, and it continued under the Tories, and they've been kept on a short leash. It's really interesting, if you look at the management of the BBC, including what the head of factual or the channel heads, They've been in their posts for a decade. Charlotte Moore has just left. She's been there for almost since the Crimean War, I think, because nobody wants to do the job. It's not really a place that encourages or invites independent thinking people who really want to cause a stir. These people have left. They all now are Jobsworths, placemakers, people like Sarah Smith, who sort of lied about what Trump said about Liz Cheney. All these people are just desperate to keep their jobs by woke virtue signaling to each other and their dinner party invitees. It's a completely different culture from what Lord Ruth wanted, what we grew up with and learned our skills within.
So do you think that that culture can be transformed? And ultimately, do you think that the BBC can be saved?
All the cultural stuff and the artistic stuff and the local radio, and there are great journalists still there. Sure, it would be nice to keep all that stuff, but the news stuff, I mean, I would do what Doge did. There needs to be a BBC Doge. It didn't go really well, the Doge thing, but there needs a Doge here where they just fire absolutely every journalist, all the people in news, and make them apply for the jobs again. And one of the things that they need to do to get their job is to show that they're not an ideologue, some weird activist, and they believe in balance and fair play.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining us. That is the documentary maker, Malcolm Clark. So that is bringing us to the end of the hour. I just have to say this from Dame Melanie Dawes, Chief Executive of Ofcom, says, I'd like to thank Tim Davie for his contribution as Director General of the BBC over the past 5 years. Tim has led at a time of great change and challenge. The BBC is a strong and valued part of our media landscape, and the BBC board will now need to reflect on how it ensures that the BBC continues to deliver for UK audiences. Well, I'm sorry, audience, that you came in, you didn't get to have a say-so. What are your feelings? Too late. You want to be quicker than that, guys. I gave you an opportunity and it's done. But you've got some free crisps. So anyway, thank you very much for joining us for Free Speech Nation. Thank you to my panel, all my brilliant guests this evening, and my underused audience. We'll see you with the next show coming up in just a few moments. Brilliant, Alan Armstrong. Bye.